Hey everyone, I'm Matt Freedman, Matt F. the Oracle. Welcome to the 11th episode of the Daily Fantasy Sports Roundtable brought to you by FantasyLabs. Last week we discussed the approach one should have to early season MLB DFS. This week we're going to go to the opposite end of the spectrum. We are recording the show on the last night of the NBA regular season, and so this episode will be focused on postseason NBA DFS for those among you who are degenerate enough to play it. Let's get started. Returning to the show for the first time since his appearance on our debut episode is Chris Raybon on Twitter at Chris Raybon. He's the senior DFS editor at 4for4.com and the host of the DFS MVP podcast. Chris, you are looking sharp as usual. Welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me on, Matt. Glad to be here.
Yeah, good to have you back. And I got to say, it's you were dynamite on that first episode. I think it was really like a great tone setter for the entire show. So it's fantastic to have you back. And then also joining us tonight for his Roundtable debut is Matt LaMarca at Matt LaMarca. He's a DFS writer and podcaster for RotoViz, and he's on the show because you can never have too many Matts on a podcast. LaMarca, how's it going?
Doing good, Matt. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, good to have you on. And then finally, back at the Roundtable is a guy who has been on the show almost as often as I have, and that is Peter Jennings at CSU Ram 88. He's a co-founder of FantasyLabs, an ESPN contributor, a DraftKings analyst, and the winner of too many GPPs to count. Peter, are you stacking the Rockies tonight?
Of course I'm stacking the Rockies. Of course I'm degenerate enough to play Fantasy NBA during the playoffs every single day. And we got Matt squared tonight, so I'm looking forward to it. And the playoffs are here. It's Kobe's last night. Steph going for 73, or the Warriors are going for 73 games. So it's a great time in sports.
Yeah, let's jump into it. By the time this episode is released on Thursday, the NBA regular season will be over. The Warriors will be the first team ever to have 73 wins in a campaign. And if you look at Kobe Bryant's Wikipedia page, it will say that he used to play professional basketball. But the season isn't really over so long as there is still DFS to be played. And so in this episode, we're going to explore postseason NBA DFS. I guess the first question is, how is postseason NBA DFS similar to the regular season game, and how is it different? Chris, what do you think?
Well, I'm going to go ahead and jump right into the differences. I think those will kind of bring out the similarities. The first is, of course, the slates are smaller. You won't really see any of those huge Wednesday night 10-game type slates anymore. There will be a lot less of poor teams and poor defenses. So as a result, a lot of players in projection models will probably be projected nearer to one another than they would be in the regular season. There will be less cheap fill-in players, less value plays for you to find, especially at lower price points. And something that I think is really important and something that I'll be highlighting as we go through this conversation is that rotations will change in the playoffs. Coaches will shorten rotations, and that will affect the minutes played of all players, particularly starters. So one thing to really keep in mind with the playoffs, especially because basketball is so statistically based, it's you can rely on models a lot, is you want to really nail down your minutes projections because they will change, and it's a really good idea to get a grasp on exactly how they're going to change for each individual player, because that will have a great impact on their projections.
Matt, do you have any thoughts there?
Yeah, well, I think first for like a similarity, you're still going to look to, Vegas lines, totals. Those are still going to be, one of the top resources for trying to determine who the good plays are going to be in a given night. But another major difference for me is just the defensive intensity that you're going to see in the playoffs. If you look at the 16 teams that made the playoffs last year, they averaged about 4 fewer points per 100 possessions in the playoffs than they did in the regular season, despite the pace being relatively similar. So I think for me personally, that means that I'm going to be paying a lot less attention to stuff like defense first position. I mean, we could debate how useful that statistic is anyway, but I think basically the defense for every team is going to turn up in the playoffs. So, I'm not scared to target a player if they had a quote unquote tough matchup by regular season numbers, because all the defenses are going to be tougher in the playoffs.
Yeah, speaking of matchups, that's another similarity that I'm going to look to a lot. I do agree the defense is going to rise up, and everyone's intensity is going to go higher. One thing that you have to account for in the playoffs is the specific matchups that the teams are going to try to exploit. This becomes much more like chess in the NBA playoffs for the coaches. They really have to figure out where they need to go to get baskets. Obviously, the stars are going to contribute even more. So one thing I'm looking for is just finding the matchups, who has a good matchup in that series, and normally that will play out. And then obviously after, a certain team starts to target a new player potentially for a couple extra shots, the other team's going to adjust. So you have to speculate how those adjustments are going to affect things. And then there's a lot of differences. The slate size, one thing that's really frustrating with the playoffs is that, you have these games play out 5 times, 6 times, and it's pretty obvious the way things are going to go. The prices don't move that much. So that's one thing you have to pay attention to. I definitely think there's the most value early on in the series.
Mm-hmm. So, Peter, you just mentioned their slate size. I think we should talk about that a little bit more. With fewer games, the slates seem to lend themselves more to tournaments than to cash games. LaMarca, let's go to you first for this question. How are you approaching tournaments in the playoffs?
Yeah, I think that the playoffs set up perfectly for GPPs, honestly. You're never going to see more than 4 games on a single slate. So that really takes cash off the table for me. There's most nights it's going to come down to, a 2-on-2 or 3 versus 3 player difference to determine a cash in a cash game. And that's just not something I'm really interested in doing. But in tournaments, we can kind of use that to our advantage. You can identify who the chalk is going to be, and then it's much easier to fade those guys in that format. All it takes is a couple of people not meeting expectations or, overperforming at a, reduced ownership percentage to sort of get a big cash there. I also think that, minutes are much more consistent in the playoffs, which kind of takes the volatility out of that for GPPs. Which is good for, players that can identify stuff like that. That's one sort of variance that you can kind of remove from the equation. And then it just comes down to things like how many shot attempts a player is going to get if they're making their jump shot on a given night. And that's a positive for someone who's a good DFS player for sure.
Yeah, I agree with that. And one other thing that I think is important that you can take advantage of with the playoffs is just the minutes that these players are going to play. You're obviously going to understand, there's recency bias. I think that's a big thing too. There's recency bias based on the matchup and the game that you're going to have over and over and over again. So people are obviously going to identify the guys who've done really well. So you can take advantage of recency bias by being more contrarian. But another thing that I think is important here to look at is just what matchup, and again, kind of going back to what I was talking about before, what matchup are they going to change? What adjustment's going to happen? And how can you identify someone who might have a much better game than the first game in the series? And that's what makes it interesting. Certainly there's not much variance in lineups, so you do have to find something unique. And oftentimes it's, finding someone who had a bad first game or second game in the series that's going to rebound based on an adjustment.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think also, in tournaments, in the regular season, I think we kind of we look more toward things like shot attempts and things like that. But even going to looking at matchups, sometimes it could be a player that just has high leverage opportunity, even if their actual maybe volume of shot attempts doesn't change. For example, a 3-point specialist, somebody who shoots a lot of threes, he doesn't necessarily need to shoot more, but in one game he could make hit say 5 of 6 of his threes, and that could be a major boost in his overall value. So you want to look at things like that, guys who crash the boards, get a lot of offensive rebounds. That gives you the potential for a lot of easy putbacks, and players who can score a lot of points per possession and things like that, even in their normal roles, sometimes can be big. I remember, I think last year, the year before, a guy like Mike Dunleavy on the Bulls, who no one was really looking at him, and he had like a huge game just because he hit a bunch of threes that he normally wouldn't have hit. So looking at things like that, the role players, especially getting a role player at the low end of the pricing spectrum. As Peter said, there's a lot of value early in the series because a team will adjust later on. So if you can get a role player early in the series before a team adjusts, that can be a big benefit.
So, Peter, you had mentioned earlier the ability to be contrarian or trying to be contrarian with these smaller slates, mathematically, because there are fewer player combinations with which you could create unique contrarian lineups, it seems like it would be harder to do that. How do you go against the grain in a small slate?
Like I talked about before, it's really important to leverage recency bias. It's the same matchup, so everyone's going to look to it. And obviously, it's hard to go against what you just saw with the same matchup. But leverage that, knowing that you can find someone. And I think there's been a couple good points made about how to, identify some players who might fit that category. Someone who shoots really badly is a great example. Someone who goes 1 for 9 or 1 for 8 from the field, or is a big 3-point shooter. I think that makes a lot of sense to identify someone who shot poorly because they might be able to bounce back in a big way. In addition to that, if you can find someone who played really poorly on the bench, maybe got a lot of minutes, and you think the team's going to make some sort of adjustment by playing someone else, maybe you identify a player who didn't play many minutes in the first game, but because you think there's going to be an adjustment, maybe they're going to be thrust into more minutes. So it's tough. It's definitely a lot harder to find these contrarian plays because there's fewer options. And, the series, the coaches are going to play a smaller rotation, but the ones that you can find, if you can find them on the right night, there's a ton of leverage because ownerships are just through the roof on certain guys in tournaments.
Yeah, I think you can also look at, when you look at the individual games on the slate, and we mentioned Vegas lines earlier, maybe you look at, say, the game with the lowest Vegas total, and you can do something like a game stack of that game where you take a few players on each team in that game, because it'll probably be the game with the lowest ownership. Because if a game goes to overtime and it's the only game that goes to overtime of the night, even if it was maybe the lowest projected game, just those extra 5 minutes could be the bump you need to get on top in a tournament, especially if you have multiple players from that same game. So things like that, thinking about player combinations, thinking about improbable probabilities, something that's unlikely to happen, but if that unlikely event occurs, what else will occur? I think you have to really pay attention to, and also how players relate to each other on the same team. You have to really be mindful of, okay, well, if Harrison Barnes goes off, what does that mean for the rest of the Warriors? You have to understand how the players play affect each other on the court. Who will actually cannibalize value if he has a great game, and where and who won't. So that's kind of some ways to go contrarian.
Yeah, I think another thing too that kind of gets overlooked occasionally when we talk about being contrarian is, if you play the guy who's, considered chalk, but you play him over the percentage of the field, you can get an advantage that way too. So if you think a guy's going to be very popular and you put him in, upwards of 100% of your lineups and he ends up being 50% owned, if he does well, you're still going to get an edge on 50% of the field. So, all the things that they mentioned in terms of finding under the radar plays, definitely things I look at. Especially guys who are coming off a string of poor performances because they always get overlooked. But definitely, I think, if you really think a guy is in such a good spot that he can't fail, there's no harm in going overweight on him too.
All right, well, let's transition to cash games. Some people just simply prefer to play cash games to tournaments regardless of the slate. So, Chris, if you are going to play cash games in the postseason, how do you navigate the smaller slates? And, I guess, does the size of the slate really even matter to you?
The size of slate definitely does matter, just because there becomes more variance and more luck and randomness involved when you do have these small slates. I think, as Matt mentioned earlier, if you're going to play cash games, you do have to realize that it many times will come down to a 3-player difference or something like that to decide who wins. However, if you're going to play cash games, I think most important is that what I mentioned before, just make sure when you're using your projections that you're accounting for the changes in minutes due to the shortened rotations in the playoffs, and just continue to trust your process and trust your model, and let your opponents make the mistakes. There will be, it is the NBA playoffs. There will be people that are playing a little less seriously. Potentially, there will be people, as Peter said, affected by recency bias. And that's not only in tournaments. That's going to be in cash games too. If a guy comes out of nowhere and has a big game in a game one, perhaps he'll go over-owned in game two, and that won't just be in tournaments. That'll be in cash games as well. So I would say just trust your process. There is going to be more luck. There is going to be more randomness, but you don't want to get fancy in a cash game. So just stick to your process, stick to your data, stick to what you've been doing all year if you've been successful.
Yeah, I mean, cash games are really all about minutes, and it's going to be the same in the playoffs. Grabbing guys who you think might see an extra boost in minutes because of, the higher stakes of the games, I think is a nice way to try and scoop some extra value for cash games. I think we'll talk later about some guys that I think are in a good spot to do that. But personally, 4 games, and that's going to be the biggest slate that you'll see in the playoffs. That's not something I have a ton of interest in playing cash games at all. But if you do, I think that, just trying to get those extra minutes, like a starter who, normally would play 30, but now might see 35, who's going to be in that, 4 to 5K range. Those guys are going to be super valuable just because there's not really any value for the most part on these slates.
Right. You guys hit on all the big points. I would just echo the minutes is so important. Identifying the role players who are going to play consistent minutes. They're going to shorten the rotation, 7-8 guys, so you can still find good bench players. And it's really important to find those players too, because the stars are going to account for so much of the production. So oftentimes you have, 2-3 stars, whatever it is, a couple solid guys, then you have to really reach on the bench. And finding those guys who okay, they're going to play 25 minutes off the bench, but they're dirt cheap. You have to kind of fit those guys in the playoffs, especially in later rounds when we have even less games.
Can we talk a little bit about minutes? We're kind of going a little bit off the script here, but so minutes just in general in the regular season, they're still very important. It seems like they're even more important in the postseason. How do you gauge the transition in minutes that will occur in the playoffs with the rotations being shortened, with some of the starters getting more minutes? How do you make that jump in those early games? Peter, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, you just bump up the starters by a decent percentage. Well, obviously not a huge percentage because they're playing the majority of the game anyways. But let's say someone's starting and they're averaging 36 minutes during the regular season, they'll bump up to like 40. The only guys you have to be careful with not to bump too much is someone like James Harden, who already plays 42 minutes a game. So just identifying those players who might play more. The Spurs are a great team to look at. They really rest and, have a really big rotation during the regular season. They'll probably shorten things up and certain guys will get significantly more minutes. So paying attention to that is really important. And certainly you'll know what the rotations are going to be after a couple of games. There'll be no secret for the most part. But those first games of the series, there's a lot of value.
And also, a lot of the teams in the playoffs this year and every year are teams that also made the playoffs last year, and many times they also have the same coaches. So another thing you can do that I found really helpful in the past is I just look back at last year's playoffs and compare players' regular season minutes last year to what bumps they got in the postseason. So, for example, a guy like Tim Duncan, who was only playing about 28 minutes per game last year, he's at about 25 this year. But last year in the playoffs, he was playing about 35 minutes per game in the playoffs. So that you can kind of use that to gauge just how big of a bump guys are going to get. The Warriors, we know they're notorious for having guys like Steph sit out the fourth quarter a lot of times, especially in the middle of the season, the dog days of the season. So you can look at, kind of how many minutes did Steph play in the playoffs and make your adjustments that way as well.
Yeah, 100% agree with that. I think looking at, the teams that are repeats and especially teams without a lot of turnover like the Clippers, the Warriors, just look and see what they did last year and you can bet that it's going to be pretty similar. Obviously, once we get some data from this year, that's going to be the ultimate, piece of information to use. But for the first couple games, at least, I would say that last year's numbers are going to be the best.
All right, so shortly before the NBA All-Star break, I wrote a piece about what I call the Ultimatum Fallacy. I think it's the mistake that people make of thinking that because they have only limited time left to play DFS in this particular sport, they need to take advantage of the time that they have left. So maybe they're more aggressive in cash games than they normally should be, or maybe they put more of their bankroll into play than they normally would. So I think that some people could make that mistake when it comes to the postseason. LaMarca, how do you manage your bankroll in the postseason? And do you, in general, treat the postseason as if it's merely a continuation of the regular season, just a continuation of that money-making opportunity, or do you give it a different type of significance?
Yeah, that was honestly a very expensive mistake that I made when I was first learning about DFS and first starting out as a player. Down the end of the season where things are so much different, I was still playing my regular amount, and I took a pretty good beating. So I definitely adjusted from that. And I think that that's something that everyone individually needs to, sort of ask themselves what their strengths are and kind of adapt. Personally, for the first round of the playoffs, at least, I'll be continuing, sort of as just though this is, a continuation of the regular season. On most nights, we're going to have 3 or 4 games to choose from, which is similar to like a small slate NBA night during the regular season. And that's something that personally is a strength of mine. So, at least to start, I have no problem playing a normal amount. But as the playoffs progress and we get down to nights with, 2 games or even fewer, then it gets to a point where I'll probably, look to scale back the percentage of my bankroll I'm putting in play.
Right. I mean, it's obviously a big mistake to ramp up the volume, probably a little less of an edge in the playoffs overall. And certainly have been there. When I first got started in DFS, I wanted to really maximize the end of my basketball season because I felt like I had a great routine with basketball. But it's foolish to do. My bankroll management doesn't change at all. I'm doing the same process and just treating it like the regular season. I will make some adjustments and maybe play less when we get down to very few games, especially once we're into the middle of the series, just because there's so few options and so few combinations of lineups that you can make that I know in cash games it's going to be 2 versus 2 or whatever, and I'm just not going to engage in those slates. But yeah, it's very similar to the regular season and manage your bankroll the same way.
Yeah, I think early on it doesn't change as much. And I think Matt made a great point about just you have to know your strengths. If you're normally a good player on short slates or you're more of a tournament player, I don't think you're really changing it much. If you're a person who thrives on those huge slates and kind of picking out the best cash game plays, then you definitely want to scale down. But as we move deeper and deeper into the playoffs and there are less and less matchups to exploit and there's less inefficiencies, the edge decreases. I think you definitely have to think about reducing the amount of money in play.
All right, well, let's talk a little bit about the dynamics of these games being in a series. So, and Peter, you had talked about this, that maybe in the middle of a series, you might not play in any given slates. And so much of the, I guess the tenure of the playoffs is based on the fact that these teams are playing each other repeatedly. So obviously that's how the postseason differs from the regular season. You have the opportunity for 2 teams to play each other 7 games in a row. How does the consistency of opponent factor into your analysis and decisions, and how much weight do you give to the regular season matchups between the 2 teams that will be facing off?
The second part of the question is really important. I think you can pick up an edge by looking at the way the matchups played out throughout the year. One thing to take into consideration is if one team might not have showed their hand, make sure you check the game log and really understand who played, what the incentive to play was. So that's something I think you can pick up a nice little edge in the beginning of a series where I think there's by far the most edge. I think we talked about it a lot. It's important to identify that the edge goes down throughout the rest of the series just because the minutes are known, the players are known, the adjustments have most likely been made by game 5, game 6, by game 7. I mean, they've kind of shown their hand at that point. So it's just much harder at that point to get a lot of differentiation in lineups. Certainly maybe some value in being contrarian in tournaments, but it's a challenge because there's not really a curveball that you could project. So maximize the edge that's in the beginning of the series.
Yeah, I think that's a great point about just looking at the game log and seeing exactly what type of incentive teams had to play, because I think it really does depend on, when they play in the regular season, was a team coming off a back-to-back in a specific game? Was a team on a long road trip? Were the same players active? Things like that. Because the difference in the playoffs now is that, as we talked about before, the defensive intensity is going to be higher. And also, this is the first time when coaches are really game planning for these teams. In the regular season, the game plans aren't aren't as thorough on a team-by-team basis, on an individual team basis from game to game. But in the playoffs, they're coming up with specific game plans. So you can kind of try to put yourself in the coach's shoes maybe a little bit and say, okay, what do we expect? What's the first type of matchups we expect them to exploit early in the series and go from there. But it really, as far as looking back on it, it really depends on the conditions. If both teams have a good incentive to play and there was no back-to-backs or crazy road trips or things like that, I think you can get a very good picture of what a team might plan to do.
Yeah, and I'm definitely giving more stock to the games that happen later in the season versus the ones that happen early in the season. Rotations change, players evolve, trades get made, all things that can, make a playoff series look drastically different than a matchup that happened, in October. So I would definitely weight the later meetings more. I do think it wouldn't be a bad GPP strategy to kind of, fade guys that have done well in these regular season spots because they're obviously going to be super popular plays. That data is pretty readily available. And, going back to what I mentioned before, the defense is just a lot more intense in the playoffs. So I think it's, it doesn't really make sense to assume that just because a guy did well against the team once, it'll necessarily happen again.
All right, well, let's continue to talk about series dynamics a little bit. So let's say, for instance, if a team is ahead 3-0 in a series, are you likelier to use the players on that team or the other team? How much do you buy into these sort of intangible factors like motivation or momentum? And even if you don't buy into those ideas, how do you take into account the knowledge that other people might be taking those factors into account? Chris, what do you think?
I think you hit it on the head with what you said at the end. Even if you don't buy into those ideas, a lot of other people might, and I think that's what it comes down to. I think in the actual playoffs, I think, yes, these intangible factors are having an effect. However, at DFS, we're dealing with data, and it's really hard to measure these intangible factors. But other people are going to try, and I think that's where you can gain an edge by kind of, you mentioned it's going to be harder to go contrarian. So there's going to be a lot of recency bias. So you can kind of look at how others are viewing these intangible factors and how that is ultimately going to affect ownership. And I think that's where you get an edge as far as the intangible factors, because the factors themselves, like, for example, if a team is up 3-0, some people are going to, some people might say, oh, well, they're going to be motivated to just close it out. And other people are going to say, they might take their foot off the gas. So if you can kind of get, it could go either way. I don't think there's a way to really nail that down. But if you can kind of understand, what the masses are saying, which way they're leaning on that spectrum, I think that gives you an edge in terms of exploiting ownership to your greatest advantage.
Yeah, and I don't really buy into motivation or momentum, but I do buy into minutes. And when teams have their backs up against the wall and they're in an elimination situation, I do think they're much more likely to push, their star players for heavier minutes. And that's something that I am interested in. I mean, if we look back at last year, the Clippers were in 3 elimination games. CP3 averaged over 42 minutes in those compared to 37 in a regular playoff game. Harden got up to 40 from 37.4 in elimination games, and that includes one where his team won by 20 and he saw less than 30 minutes. And LeBron got up to almost 45 minutes in elimination games or when his team is trailing in the series. So I do think there's something to be said for, a back against the wall type situation, the coach, giving their best player some extra run. But, I don't really think that it works in the opposite way where a team who's up, has that extra motivation to close out a series. I don't really buy into that. But, anytime I can get a star player playing some extra minutes, I'm definitely interested in that.
Those are all really good points. Certainly things I'm taking into account as well. It's one of those things. I'm more of a narrative street guy than most, so I'll buy into that, and I'll even try to create some narratives that might be a stretch and maybe go off those. But yeah, I think there's value in understanding which guys are going to like Matt just mentioned, which guys have their backs up against the wall. Which guys are going to play a lot in those, clinching games. So it's one of those things that is a small edge, but you have to take every one of those during the playoffs.
All right, Peter, if you are buying into certain narratives and leveraging those, which are the narratives that seem to be more predictive or even if they're not predictive, more actionable than other narratives?
It's a tough question. And it really depends on the series, but sometimes, I'll see a player that I really like struggle off the bat, and then I believe that the team's going to make a really good adjustment, or that player, is going to refuse to get shut down. That's normally what I'll do. I really like to kind of rely on, bounce back games from star players or on the verge of becoming star players.
Mm-hmm. That's just, and I mean, I think you could say that that's not even, I mean, there's obviously a narrative there because you're looking at a story unfold. But that's also just looking at eventually the production averaging out to what you would expect across the series. And I think something like that makes sense.
Right. Players are going to normalize, but oftentimes after a game one or a game two, especially if they struggle twice, like a superstar struggling twice, the media is just going nuts about how they're struggling, and they're showing why the defenses are doing well against them. And, people are talking, is that player broken? And that's a great time to buy low. Normally their price goes down too in DFS, which is great. So it makes sense from a mathematical standpoint, and normally it's a narrative I can get behind.
Mm-hmm, that makes sense. All right. So as I mentioned earlier, we are recording this on Wednesday night, the final night of the NBA regular season. So we can't say for sure what the exact matchups are, but in general, it seems like in the playoffs, there will be more high-quality players in these slates on a per-player basis. So more superstars, then also better complementary players coming off of the bench. How does that slate composition in turn impact the way that you construct your roster? So are you likelier to go stars and scrubs, or is it more of a balanced approach for your teams? LaMarca, what do you think?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously the pricing is going to dictate that each night, but I think my default strategy is going to be sort of a balanced approach. I think that, for one thing, the value plays in the postseason are just going to be drastically less in terms of quantity and quality than what we were getting, especially late in the regular season. Between shortening up the bench, you're not going to get any rest days in the playoffs. Very rarely there's an injury that you can sort of capitalize on. So you're going to see, the same guys sort of in the same roles most games. As a result, it's just hard to find a guy that you can plug in at a low price tag that, we can expect to hit value, especially in a tournament. If there is an injury or something does come up that does provide some value, I won't be afraid to take it. But I just think for the most part, because there's just a lack of good low-cost options, going balanced kind of makes the most sense.
I'm going a little different. I mean, if you can make a balanced team, I get it. Oftentimes there's just, the stars are really what you have an option with, and it's tough to find kind of the mid-range guys. So I don't like to say stars and scrubs. I like to say stars and bench role players. And that's oftentimes what ends up happening for me if I look back at my rosters from playoffs in years past. It's identifying that guy who comes off the bench that's cheap, that plays 20, 25 minutes, and then getting in the stars, because the stars really have just huge production. I mean, Westbrook, Durant, Harden, Curry, all these guys, LeBron, these guys are all going to put up huge stat lines every single game. Maybe with the exception of a couple, slight down performances, but it's never going to be a usage thing. So I'm going to build stars and quality role players.
Yeah, I have to agree more with the stars and scrubs mentality. It definitely depends on the slate, but what I found is that with the stars, as Peter mentioned, it's just so much usage, and the mid-range players are just a little easier to replace. Whereas if a star goes for 60, 70 fantasy points in a night, a lot of times, even if you have a balanced approach, it's hard to find two guys that can equal even that one star's production. So I tend to lean towards getting as many stars as I can as possible, because when we talk about minutes and shortened rotations, that can also benefit bench players sometimes, because a bench player who normally might have been getting, say, 17 minutes a night, he might now start getting maybe 22 22, 23 because they're knocking out that 10th, 11th, 12th man out of the rotation. So I'm always looking for those bench guys that are going to get the minutes and trying to couple them with stars, because it's really hard to replace a star's production when he goes off on a short slate.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, Chris, you just mentioned right there the possibility of going after particular players, especially as Pete would say, those quality bench players who might be getting more minutes. So let's talk specifically about some players. At the end of the season, some teams were resting their players. Other teams were playing not scrubs, but quality bench players. And so the minutes and production and the salaries of some players at the end of the season might not be representative of who those players are likely to be in the playoffs. So assuming that there is some price continuity on DFS platforms from the regular season to now, who are the players you think are likely to be overvalued or undervalued, especially in the early games of the postseason? Pete, what do you think?
I'll take some Spurs guys off the bat. So someone like Boris Diaw, someone like David West, someone like Manu Ginobili, guys who aren't going to play a lot. The veterans, I think they'll see more minutes, and those are guys that you can take knowing that they're going to be cheap. I mean, David West is like min price. Those are guys you can take to fill in your roster that are solid veterans who know the playoffs. They're going to produce relatively well on a permanent basis. They should get decent run, for a team like the Spurs.
All right. Chris, do you have any thoughts there?
Oh, yeah, definitely. I think the Spurs always stick out as a number one. As I mentioned, Tim Duncan's minutes, he went up about 7-8 minutes per game in last year's playoffs. I think guys that have been injured, Blake Griffin coming back, he was around, I think, 7,300 last time I looked. He was a 9-10K player. When he was playing normally, Kyle Lowry's price is down right now, about under 7K. He's a mid-800s player. So guys like that, definitely.
Yeah, I mean, obviously all the Spurs, Tony Parker as well, I think is another guy that I think will get a bump up to like the 30-minute plateau. And when he hits that threshold, you can usually pencil him in for, around 30 fantasy points. A guy I've got my eyes on is Andre Iguodala. He jumped up by, almost 4 minutes a game in the playoffs last year. They rolled out that, quote unquote lineup of death with, all shooters on the floor. It really worked for them against the Cavs. I think that they'll break that lineup out a lot, and he'll be somebody that, we can pencil in at a pretty cheap price who's going to, really be able to get us value.
Mm-hmm. All right.
I love that call. Iggy all day, finals MVP last year. I think that's a great call. And the Warriors in general, we'll see what their rotation looks like, but Sean Livingston will play a lot too. I think that's a good team, them and the Spurs, to really look at.
All right, guys, solid showing here. Very much appreciated. Let's go around the table one more time for some final words of wisdom. Chris, what do you have?
Just remember regression to the mean. It happens even in these series because teams are playing each other so many times in a row. You'll see outliers on a game-to-game basis, and sometimes just betting against those outliers in the next game, while a lot of the public is still using their recency bias, is a way to get ahead. I mentioned, a guy who, shoots very well from three in one game, or a guy who gets a few extra steals or a few extra rebounds, and that puts him way overvalued. He may be overvalued the next game because it's when you have such a limited player pool, it's hard for people to help having some recency bias there, but things tend to regress pretty quickly in the NBA. So especially for role players, that's something I really pay attention to. When a role player overperforms one game, just regression to the mean combined with the fact that coaching staffs are making adjustments on a game-to-game basis. I like to kind of fade the role players that played well last game and choose the role players who had maybe an off game the game before, whereas with the stars, it's usually you always want those guys in your lineup. So I'm not paying as much of attention to what they do on a game by game basis. I'm more just betting on them, seeing a lot of usage.
Mm-hmm. LaMarca, closing thoughts.
Yeah, definitely agree with what Chris just said. I think that it's very easy to write off guys who have had bad games and say that, the moment's too big for them or it's a bad matchup. And, regression to the mean definitely is going to happen. Adding that with, guys, with quote unquote tough matchups, I think those are two of the best ways to try and find some, under-owned players in what are going to be really short slates and really slates that are going to be tough to differentiate yourself.
Yeah, great points. A lot of fun doing the show with Chris and Matt, and obviously Matt squared, I should say. It was a good time. Very excited for the playoffs. Bullish on the Warriors to repeat, and I think the point Chris made about Blake Griffin, remember last year he dominated the Spurs and looked like one of the top 2 or 3 players in the NBA. I think people might be sleeping on him. Recency bias definitely, is there. And I think they're going to have a decent matchup with Portland. So I like Blake Griffin a lot this playoff season.
All right, good stuff. Guys, thanks for being on the show, and thanks especially for being easy on the eyes, especially you, Chris. We've been speaking with Chris Raybon, Matt LaMarca, and Peter Jennings. You can follow them on Twitter at Chris Raybon, Matt LaMarca, and CSURam88. And you can follow me on Twitter at Matt F. The Oracle. I'm Matt Freedman, and this has been the Daily Fantasy Sports Roundtable brought to you by FantasyLabs. Thanks for tuning in.